Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Good morning. Good morning to those of you who are joining us over the internet. We're very excited about today's presentation. If anybody in the audience would like to move up a little closer, those of you coming into the room, if you want to sit in the front, it's really okay. There's nothing wrong with the seats in the front. They're not broken. Come on up if you want to. I'm not sensing a groundswell of, okay. Anyway, today we are really excited to welcome Dr. Gena Castro-Rodriguez. She is the Chief of Victim Services and Parallel Justice Programs at the San Francisco DA's office. She's one of our very valued partners, and she's responsible for managing the Victim Services Division and staff of advocacy, staff of victim advocates, claims unit, the restitution unit, and the sentencing planners. That's the parallel justice program. She, of course, develops and implements programs, services, policies to serve and respond to crime victims in San Francisco. But she's also a trainer, researcher, and writer. She contributes to knowledge about victim services, effects of trauma, and work in crime prevention and safety. She's an adjunct professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and the University of San Francisco. And she participates in city, state, and national policy initiatives to address crime victims and survivors and further the cause of helping victims recover and restore their lives. We're really lucky to have her here presenting to us today. And without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Gena Castro-Rodriguez.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. And just tell me if I get out of range because I walk around a lot. Really glad to be here, except that as soon as I got out, my nose started running, so I know I'm back in Sacramento, the allergy issues. I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview of my work so that you kind of understand how I got interested in trauma and why I do training. I actually started here in Sacramento. I won't say how many years ago, but when I was an undergrad at Sacramento State, working with kids in the dependency system, got very interested in the relationship between trauma, childhood abuse, and then later challenges. I worked with ages 2 all the way to 18 and saw kind of a transition between their own victimization as children and then risk-taking behavior. Got very interested in that. I ran a group home for a little while on the Central Coast. I ran a community center in Watsonville, California, and then moved to San Francisco in the late 90s. And at that time, I ran one of the largest community-based organizations in the Mission District, which is a primarily Latino area of San Francisco, and did everything from early childhood education to intensive gang involvement programs. And during that time, I got really interested in looking at girls and how girls reacted to trauma and presented behaviors related to trauma. So I co-founded an organization called the Girls Justice Initiative, which looked at the transition of girls that were involved in dependency crossing over into delinquency. And about 5 years into the work, what we realized was this not just a correlation with trauma, but also some causation factors. We expanded the work to serve young men also, and it became the Youth Justice Institute. And for 10 years, I ran the organization, served about 4,500 young people throughout the Bay Area who were at risk for involved in the juvenile and then criminal justice system, and did a lot of work at the DJJ facility for girls in Ventura. I left that organization to finish my doctorate, did my dissertation on the relationship between sexual trauma and delinquency for African American and Latina girls, really dove deep on what happens with trauma, what is the neurological, biological, and social processes that happen with trauma. I've been writing about that ever since. I was asked to come to the DA's office to really look at how to become a trauma-informed office. We've done a lot of changes in the last year and a half that I've been there in our advocacy and our claims unit. Very proud of the work that the staff are doing there, our growing staff. We're at 30 now. Hopefully by the end of next week, we'll be at 36. And then just took on the sentencing planning program, which is our parallel justice program. And that's where we have planners who go out and work with our defendants to look at their childhood trauma, their substance abuse, their mental health issues, homelessness, any of the things that contribute to their criminal behavior, and see if we can address those through treatment to try to decrease the prison population. So although I'm doing a lot of different things, they all sort of tie back together with the idea of trauma. So today my goal is to help give you some information about the biological, the neurological, and the neurochemical process of trauma, how it affects behavior and how it affects memory. And I think what I do pretty well in these kinds of trainings is translate complicated information into digestible information that you can use in your work. Because it doesn't do any good for me to sit up here and talk about things that don't really relate to what you are doing. So I'm going to work very hard to make sure that it's something that you take away some information to do things differently in your day-to-day work today. Okay, so let's talk about the agenda real quick. It sounds like I'm going to go over a lot, but it ties together really well, so don't worry. I'm going to talk about trauma in general. We throw the term trauma out a lot, but I'm going to really just give you some very quick framework for knowing what trauma is. There was a case this week that someone said that there was a victim that was traumatized because their laptop had been stolen. Now that victim might be frustrated, that victim might be upset, that victim might feel violated and wrongfully angry, but that victim's not traumatized. And so we'll talk about what trauma is. I'm going to talk about neurobiology, but I'm going to talk about it in a way that you're going to walk away with a diagram for the brain in your hand, literally, and understand what's going on. I'll talk about the HPA axis, which is really just our fight, flight, or freeze response. All of us have it. Sorry, am I walking out of frame? Okay. It's our fight, flight, or freeze response. Every single one of them have it. It's biological. It's what saved the caveman from the dinosaur. We use it when we're in danger. The problem is when we use it when we're not in danger, or when it gets activated when the system has been dysregulated. So I'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about memory and trauma. And this is what's really important. It's something that's misunderstood. And I've been doing some consulting with our district attorneys on their cases when they have questions about why would this victim be responding this way? Why would this behavior have happened? And there's actually really good neurological explanations for those things. So I'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about re-experiencing and why people who've experienced trauma sometimes struggle with ongoing symptoms related to the trauma, including one of the hardest for them to manage emotionally, which is the re-experiencing of the trauma. The thing that is most debilitating for people with trauma is the re-experiencing of it. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the way that trauma victims can present, and it can be misread. So their affect, their behavior, or their emotions can be misread. Because this might be some of the information that you're coming into contact with that you're trying to reconcile and doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay? We'll do that all in 2 hours. And I got my energy drink, so we're going to be fine. All right, so let's talk about trauma first. We have trauma is a serious injury, a threatening of life, or observing the loss of life, imminent threat, or violation of personal safety or integrity. So it has to be pretty profound. Now here's the thing. An adult can perceive this differently than a child can. So for an adult, perceiving being at risk for dying or an imminent threat or violation of your personal safety might be a higher bar than a child. So a child can have something less intense happen to them, but perceive the danger much higher and actually can be traumatized in a different way than an adult can. So that's how kids, it's one of the ways, and I'm going to talk about lots of ways today, but that's one of the ways that kids react to trauma differently. They're impacted by trauma differently because little kids are little. Their sense of safety is different than ours. Their sense of control is different than ours. So things are scarier to them than it would be to an adult because we are physically bigger, we are cognitively have more capacity, we can take care of ourselves in a different way. So kids can actually be affected by trauma just watching things or having things happen around them. So like witnessing domestic violence. They don't actually have to be the target of the violence, but witnessing the violence against other people can feel like an imminent threat or a threat of physical harm to them. All right, here's the other thing that we have to have. It has to produce terror, horror, or helplessness. So you can't just be frustrated. Missing the bus is not traumatizing. It's irritating, but it's not traumatizing. So it has to induce very intense feelings. Feelings that you don't control. Feelings that come up from the amygdala, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then it has to be real or perceived. So it can be actually happening, or you can be convinced that it's going to happen. It can be real to you. It can be direct or indirect. So we now know post 9/11 that trauma doesn't just happen to the person who is the target of the violence or of the victimization, but it can also happen to people who work with people who've experienced trauma, who witness trauma, who are surrounded or affected by the trauma. They can also experience it. And then the last thing is it can be chronic or complex. So chronic means that either the same trauma is happening over and over again. Child abuse is a sad but good example of something that happens over and over again. And then complex means that it happens in a caregiving relationship. So there's a different dynamic to trauma when it actually happens that the perpetrator is someone that was supposed to be your caregiver, that was supposed to take care of you and love you and be the person that keeps you alive. That adds another layer of complexity to the trauma. So the treatment is different for that kind of a trauma. So if you're a child and you're the victim of trauma by a stranger, you have theoretically your caregiver, your family to go back to assist with the healing, to assist with the repair, to recreate the safety for you, to be part of your recovery. But if your parent or your caregiver is actually the people who perpetrate you, your trauma doesn't have a post. You don't go back to a safe caregiving relationship. You don't go back to recovery. You don't have a safe place to go back to. So your trauma is different, and it tends to be complex and chronic. All right, so this is the brain, and I'm going to give you a diagram to take home with you. So this is also the brain, your hand. If you put up your right fist and hold it out to the audience this way, this is a diagram of the brain. So your wrist here is the brainstem. This is the part of the brain that is functioning when you're born. When you're born, you have 100 billion neurons in your head, and they're not connected yet. Those synapses are going to begin connecting as soon as you breathe life. But the base of your brain, the brain stem, is working. That's how your organs are functioning, how your blood is flowing, how your eyes are working, how your fluids are moving. All of that is in your brain stem. This is the prehistoric part of our brain. And the brain's going to develop from the bottom forward and from the inside out. So we actually have bidirectional brain development. So I'm going to use this during the day to show you the different places that things happen. And this is I hope you can see that, but this is a diagram of the brain. I'm going to point to some of the important pieces that we talk about during trauma. So the first one is the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is, oh, that might not work, sorry. So the pituitary gland, it's in the bottom. It's kind of that little piece that hangs down. This is where we have growth hormone. So our growth hormones come from our pituitary gland. But in trauma, this hormone stimulates our adrenal glands, which are over our kidneys. And that's going to be important in a moment for chemicals that respond to trauma. And then we have our amygdala. Our amygdala is right here in the middle. It's kind of this finger-shaped piece right in the middle of our brain. And the amygdala, it's really the part of our brain that responds to safety. Whenever we are unsafe, whenever it processes our emotions, whenever we need to kick into action, the amygdala is what's going to take over. Now, interestingly, for adolescents, they're at about mid-brain development in adolescence moving into young adulthood, and they're sort of active in this middle part of the brain. So either you might remember, or maybe you now have an adolescent that's kind of emotional, moody, swings up and down between happiness, boredom, and anger. That's all this middle part of the brain. So there's a lot of activity going on in this part of the brain at that time. So what we know for trauma is that this piece is what gets activated when people are afraid or threatened or in danger. Your amygdala kicks in. And when your amygdala kicks in and everything is focused on that center part of your brain, this front part of your brain, which is called the executive functioning or the frontal lobe, that's responsible for executive thinking, things like decision making, goal setting, planning, starting and stopping an activity, that part actually goes offline. And Dan Siegel, a researcher, says that that's called flipping your lid. So it actually disconnects the thinking part of your mind from the emotional part of your mind. And so you can't do those two things very well. If right now there was an alarm going off and we could hear crashes and maybe a little bits of smoke were coming in, and I said, we're going to do a math exam, no one would do very well on a math exam right now because the amygdala is saying, are you crazy? We're in danger. We should be doing something to get out of here. So that's a very important part of our brain. And then we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to come into play later, but the hypothalamus regulates our blood pressure, our body temperature. You know, it's the thing that's going to get activated in trauma that makes our hands sweat, our heart kind of race, our stomach feel a little bit nauseous. That's the hypothalamus getting activated. And we have the hippocampus, and the hippocampus does a lot of stuff. It processes information kind of like a memory chip. It processes our conscious information, the things that we're paying attention to. Right now, you're listening to the things I'm saying. That information is going in and it's being processed. You're listening to it. You might be relating it to something. You're visualizing something. It's all getting processed right now. It's also where memories are held and stored. So it's the beginning process of memory. You're taking in information, and that information is going to hold for a little while before it gets shipped to long-term memory. It organizes information. I'm going to show you a graphic that really displays how that happens. But right now, there's a lot of things happening. I'm speaking, there's lights, there's sounds, maybe you're drinking some water, you're writing something down. There's a lot of sensory information coming in. The hypothalamus, hippocampus, is going to organize that information, right? Because you're not focused on every single one of those things in the same way. The hippocampus is going to organize that. And then we have Broca's area. And Broca's area is the area of speech, but for trauma, it also translates the information that's coming in into verbal memory. So if I asked you right now your earliest memory, most of you are not going to have a memory before the age of 2, around the time that you're verbal. That's because you're going to have sensory memories before that, but until you're verbal, you don't really have the ability to bring your memory into a narrative, to remember it in that way. You might remember a picture, you might remember feeling, you know, happy at a park, or the feelings at a birthday party, or maybe, you know, hugging someone, but you don't have a narrative around that yet, because until you have verbal development, you don't put those memories into verbal context, right? You can't put it into a narrative. Now, something around trauma is going to happen that affects this area. That's why it's important. All right, it gets turned off in trauma. This is very important when we ask people to recall their experience. So this capacity to turn the memory into a narrative or a story gets turned off. If you've ever been in a car accident or you've had a serious injury, it's very common to not remember the events surrounding that trauma, right? It's very common to say, one minute I was listening to the radio, the next minute I'm at the hospital. One moment I was talking to someone, and then I'm in an ambulance. So there's a period of time where things are happening, your body is still functioning, but you're not processing the information in the same way. It's because it turns off during trauma. And then it causes one to experience emotions and the physical part of the memory rather than the verbal part of the memory. So you can remember sensations, you can remember sounds, smells, feelings, even visual things, but you can't put it together in verbal language. That's because this gets turned off. And then we have the prefrontal lobe. So that's that front part that I told you, that's the executive functioning of the brain. And that's important because this is where we encode and organize information. It's where we take the information and make sense out of it. You know how you have a dream and, you know, maybe you talk to a friend on Wednesday and then a couple of days later that person shows up in your dream? Well, that person is showing up in this emotional part. It's showing up because you remember them, because you're thinking about that. It's the front of your brain that's trying to make sense of that. So all of a sudden it goes from the person being into your dream into a story. That's the front of your brain trying to make sense of why would that person be there and where do I know them and how do I make sense. Now remember I said during trauma, the amygdala has taken over and this has disconnected. So those two pieces are not working together like they're working together right now while you're not in trauma. Right now, you're taking in information. You might be thinking about things, but you're processing it and putting it all together into categories. I'm going to show you how that happens in a minute. And then the last thing is it helps you remember sequence. So for most people, if I said, name the first thing you did when you got up this morning, and then think about the second thing you did, and the third thing, most of us would reasonably remember the big things that we did in order. That's because while they were happening, that information was coming in, and then our frontal lobe was processing that and sequencing it. First we got up, and then we brushed our teeth, and then we got coffee, or whatever that process is. Our brain is putting that in order, so later we can recall them in that order. During trauma, that doesn't happen. So sometimes when trauma victims recall their trauma, they recall it in the wrong order. And the problem is, if they recall it in the wrong order, then we don't believe them, because we're not in trauma brain. So we don't understand why you don't remember what you did when you first got up, or who called who first, or who texted, or who did what. Because we're organizing it with these two things connected. And they are not organizing it because these two things are offline. So that's how things get out of sequential order. And we'll talk a little bit about when we ask the questions and how we get the information. And it's actually at the worst time for trauma. This is from an article called The Anatomy of Trauma. All the references are at the end of it. And I also talk a lot about Rebecca Campbell. I'll talk about her in a minute when we get to memory. All right, so this is our HPA axis. Everyone has an HPA axis. It begins in our head with our pituitary and our hypothalamus, and it goes to our adrenal gland. This is the thing that allows us to survive. This is the mechanism in our body that protects us. It's called our survival mechanism. We all have it. It's innate. We've had it since the beginning of humanity. It gives us the capacity to be able to respond to danger. If a bear were to run into the room right now, and I train a lot of police officers, so when I say this, it's different, but if a bear runs into the room, most of us will get up and run out of that exit door. A couple of you might run towards the bear and try to wrestle the bear down. And some of you might freeze and not be able to move because there's a bear in the room, right? When I trained police officers, they all laughed because they said we would run towards the bear. So they would all run towards the bear, but all of us are going to have some kind of an innate response. So there are chemical processes that are happening in the HPA axis. The first thing is this chemical called, and I mess this up every time, catecholamines. So catecholamines is one of the first chemicals that are going to get released. And this prepares the body for energy. So this is the hypothalamus saying, something's wrong. We need to start releasing chemicals so that we can react. If you've ever been driving down a freeway and someone kind of swerves into your lane and you react before you even think about it, this chemical process is happening. Before this front part of the brain has time to process what's going on, you've already moved to try to keep yourself safe, right? The second chemical, the catecholamines damage memory. So these chemicals, the HPA axis chemicals, were meant for us to survive. It was meant to be rare. In the event of something life-threatening, these chemicals will surge through our body. They'll keep us safe for that moment. They'll extinguish anywhere between 30 minutes and 96 hours, and they won't hurt our body, right? If something happens to you on the way to work, someone swerves into your lane and you have to swerve, you'll get to work, maybe you'll tell someone about it, you'll have some coffee, you'll call somebody and tell them what happened, and then it'll go away. That shaky feeling, nervousness will go away, the palms will stop sweating, your stomach will stop hurting, and you'll be okay in a little while. If it's significant, it's going to take longer for those chemicals to go out because more of those chemicals are going to go in. The challenge is that those chemicals are actually toxic to our system. So if they happen very rarely when we are actually in a life and death situation, that's okay. The benefit outweighs the risk. It's only going to happen occasionally. Those chemicals are going to go away. The problem is for people that are in chronic or complex or ongoing trauma, those chemicals get activated over and over and over again, and they actually damage our organs. So we know now that that damage has long-term health effects. So there's something called the ACEs study that was done by Kaiser, and many of you probably heard about it about 20 years ago, where they studied 17,000 people who were accessing Kaiser services and found that people who had what they call adverse childhood experiences or traumas in their early childhood had significant correlation with high health problems later on. Things like heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, inflammatory diseases, even suicidality or suicidal behavior, cigarette smoking, substance abuse. All of these things increase the more adverse childhood experiences they had. So there's two reasons. One is that trauma creates this biochemical process that's poisoning the body. But two, when it happens to children, it actually affects the development of those organs. So it's not just that an adult has the trauma and it affects their existing development. It happens to children while they're developing, and it changes the development. And that's how we see these really long-term health problems for people. It also impairs rational thought. So This chemical doesn't allow you to think rationally, because if it did, you wouldn't jump to safety. You wouldn't run out of a room. You wouldn't do the kinds of things that you might need in order to survive. But if your rational brain was thinking, you might be thinking about the risk, and that would cause you to hesitate, and then you wouldn't live. So it's going to disconnect from the rational brain. That way you can survive. You know, people jump out of moving cars, or they jump across buildings, or they do things that they wouldn't normally do because they have to in order to survive. Then we have cortisol. So cortisol is the next chemical that's going to be released, and cortisol is going to give you energy. Cortisol is going to allow you to run or jump. Sometimes run and jump faster than you thought you could run or jump, right? Because that burst of energy is going to really push us to a level that we wouldn't be at when we were just sitting and the trauma just started, or the threat just started. It reduces energy available in other places. It's going to move all of the energy that might be using to digest food or for other purposes to your extremities, so that you can get up and fight or flight. You can get out of there. It impairs immune function. So temporarily, all the energy is focusing on you moving. In the long term, it impairs your ability to fight disease. Opioids are going to get released. So we know we use opioids for pain relief, but we have natural opioids in our system. And in the moment, it's going to ignite all of those chemicals so that you don't feel the pain right away. If you've ever had a serious injury, you know that you don't initially feel the pain, right? You could think that it's shock, or you could think that the pain just hasn't set in. It's these opiates that are being released. The reason that you have to do that is that's for survival, because if we felt the intense pain right away, then we wouldn't be able to move and do the other things. So that chemical kicks in so that we can still move and try to get away. It causes flat affect, though, because all of the energy is going to the physical crisis, to the physical pain, and so it disconnects from this emotional part. There's another interesting thing that's related to this cutting behavior or self-harm behavior. So the reason that self-harm behavior works, even though it's a very maladaptive coping mechanism, is that when you're having emotional pain, if you create a physical pain, you can't have the two things happen at the same time. So you have physical pain, your body's going to release those opioids and other chemicals, and all the energy is going to get directed at the physical crisis, and it's going to calm the emotional crisis down temporarily. So that's why it works. The problem is it's not a great coping strategy. It's called maladaptive, because we don't want people to keep having to cut themselves when they feel bad. We want to find more positive coping strategies so that they don't have to do that. All right, and then we have oxytocin. So oxytocin, is kind of like the feel-good or the love chemical. When you meet someone, when you're attracted to them, when you're falling in love, oxytocin is that thing that makes you do things like, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to leave someone's house even though you would rather sleep in, or drive 3 hours to see someone, or, all those sacrifices you'll make in the beginning. That's all the oxytocin that's making you want to do things that later on will be very annoying to you, like the socks on the floor or the wet towels or all of that stuff. This oxytocin is blinding you to all of that. It's also released in this traumatic process, though. And so here's the thing. It impairs memory. Because you have this good feeling, you forget things. Oxytocin is related to giving birth. You know how it was horrible in that moment, but then later you kind of don't recall it as badly, because if you did, you wouldn't do it the second time. So that oxytocin helps you lose a little bit of all of the intense feelings that are around that, so that you say, that wasn't that bad, I'll do it again, right, Shanti? It also causes trauma bonding. So this is very interesting. So that same chemical that makes you fall in love with the love of your life can also be present when you're being sexually assaulted, when you're being abused, when you're being exploited, when you're being violated or violence against you in a relationship. That same chemical is being released in that trauma. So we know that it's responsible for trauma bonding, which is something that we talk about in exploitation relationships. That even though someone is hurting you, even though someone is doing something that you don't want, these chemicals are getting released, and it's very confusing because you feel some closeness, you feel some intimacy with that person, even though it's not wanted. And so later that can play out in shaming and guilt, and even the way that someone recalls the story, and cause some behaviors that don't make sense. And I'll talk about a case in a little while. All right, so these are all our survival defense mechanisms. These are the things that keep us alive. I have to drink my energy drink. We have two categories of survival mechanisms. We have mobilizing and immobilizing. So our mobilizing ones let us move and get away. Our immobilizing ones are also survival mechanisms, but they make us stay put. So the first one is flight. In flight, we get hyper aroused. Remember, all those chemicals are going to go to our extremities. All the energy is going to start getting activated by the chemicals, and we can get alert and prepared to fight back, to protect ourselves, to pick up things, to move things, to get away. All of that stuff is going to start happening, and those chemicals are going to let us assess the situation. We're going to make decisions really quickly, activated by these chemicals. It's also going to allow us to flight. So if we assess that our best chance for survival is to get out of here, those chemicals are going to allow us to do it. So we're going to assess that retreat is necessary, right? We're going to assess quickly the situation. I can't fight that person. I can't fight that predator. I can't get away from this danger. I need to get out of here. And that's all going to happen in seconds. Remember, we're not using the thinking part of our brain. Those chemicals are kicking in and helping us make the decisions. Now, on the other side, we have immobilizing responses that can also protect us. So the first one that isn't talked a lot about is freeze. And freeze is that we have quickly decided that staying put is our best mechanism for survival. So it's conscious. It's happening because of the biochemistry that's happening, but we could move if we wanted to. We just think that this is our best chance for survival. That's going to be important in a second. You might feel paralyzed or like you can't move, but you really could move. If you've ever been about to get on a roller coaster, or maybe about to bungee jump, or about to skydive, there's a moment where you feel like you can't move. You know that you could, but you're so afraid or you're so fearful that you feel like you can't move. So you're conscious, you know what's going on, you really could move, but you feel like you can't. I can't go in that room because it's dark. I can't walk down that hallway. It's immobilizing, but you're conscious about it. And then there's tonic immobility. And this is something that comes up in significant trauma and often correlated with sexual trauma. And tonic immobility is different because it is not conscious and you're not in control of it. Tonic immobility is physical restraint that happens because of immobilizing fear. Has anybody ever had that dream where you can't move? You have that dream and you want to move or you want to yell and you can't do it. That's a little bit of a sensation of what tonic mobility is, but it's when you're awake. So the trauma is happening to someone and they know what's going on and they can't remove themselves from it. I worked on a case in Florida a few years ago when I was an expert witness before I came to the DA's office. And the young woman, when she was a child, there was a lot of violence that would happen around her, a lot of domestic violence, a lot of substance abuse, a lot of violence in general around people. And she would sit in front of the TV and know that she should move, know that she didn't want to be there, know that she was putting herself at risk, but couldn't move her body. And she described that sensation as feeling like she was in one of those dreams where she couldn't move. She just couldn't get herself to even stand up and walk out of the room because she was immobilized. Survival is extremely threatened. So this won't happen because you're going to get an exam at the end of this workshop. This won't happen because you missed the bus or something gets stolen. This happens when you are in a life or death situation. And the experience is actually quite frightening for people. And later, it unfortunately leads to a lot of guilt because people don't understand why they weren't able to do something. Sometimes people have seen an event happen and they didn't move forward quickly, or they didn't help someone, or they didn't act on it very quickly. This is kind of a small taste of what tonic immobility is, the inability to do what they want to do, and then later there's regrets about it. It's also known as rape-induced paralysis because it's really highly correlated with sexual assaults. It happens a lot to people who are sexually violated, that they're conscious of what's going on, and maybe there's some initial reaction of fight or flight, and then they go into this tonic immobility and can't move. And then we have a lot of blaming and shame that goes on after it. It's an automatic response from that HPA axis. So too many chemicals have flooded, and it's now caused this paralyzing reaction. and it causes profound motor inhibition. So they really can't move their body. It's, remember that feeling in the dream. You want to move, you want to yell, and you can't do it. 12 to 50% of rape victims experience this. The range is 12 to 50 because a lot of people don't know that this actually exists, and a lot of people feel guilty about it afterwards and think that it was them, that they were preventing themselves from doing something, and so they don't recognize that this is what's happened. And it's more common in victims with a history of sexual abuse or trauma. So like I said, the young woman that I worked with, that when she was a child, she couldn't move in that situation and she felt tonic immobility. She could not get herself out of it. Later, when she was an adult, the case that I worked on when she was 24 years old, she had a similar reaction when another trauma was happening. She was not able to act, to react, to do normal things that someone in that position would have done, because what she had learned is that was a survival mechanism for her. Her body went back to that place, and that's how she protected herself. So even though when she was an adult, she actually wanted to do something different, her body kicked in and had the same reaction that she had when she was a child. And it leads to increased victim blaming. It brings a lot of shame for victims, and it really prevents healing because victims will really dwell on what they didn't do and blame themselves for what happened. And then people who don't understand it will further exacerbate that by blaming them or questioning them. And a really common question when I work with law enforcement is, why didn't you do this? Or if that was really happening, why didn't you get up and leave? Or if the door wasn't locked and you weren't chained down, I would have got up and left. That's because you're speaking from a non-trauma brain, not a trauma brain, having the reactions, the biochemical, uncontrolled reactions that are happening to that person when they're the one in danger. So those logical things are part of this part of the brain that are not accessible to a person who's in trauma. You can think about them later, but you didn't have access to those when the trauma was happening. All right, so let's talk about memory and trauma. Actually, let's stop for a second. Does anybody have any questions so far before we move to memory? It's a lot of information that goes quick, and I speak fast. So if you have questions, please ask them as they come up. So I hope that you're getting the feeling that trauma is really, it's a process that happens for everyone. It's neurological, neurochemical. We don't control it. Our body kicks in and takes over and is trying to survive. Later, when we're going to look at what happened, we're thinking of things from a non-traumatic brain where these things are connected, and it's hard for us to understand what happened in that situation. The other thing is that we all have different capacities. We all have different reactions. Remember, you can fight, flight, or freeze. So if I'm over here in non-trauma brain and my reaction is to fight, which is sort of the training and the disposition of law enforcement people, then they don't understand people who freeze or who run, right? Because their logical brain says this is what I would do. And so trauma victims can get a lot of questioning that really feeds that blame and that doubt. And when this person over here isn't trying to do that, they're just coming from a very different place. So it's really important for law enforcement and interviewers and crisis counselors to understand that where they are is not where this group is over here, and not where they were when the trauma happened. They're in two different places. And that all feeds shame later, because later when this person's, all those chemicals have extinguished and they're back in this brain, they don't understand it either. They're not sure why these things happened. And so this kind of information is actually really helpful for them to understand that this is a process that happened without your conscious will. Without you making decisions, this stuff is happening. All right, so now let's talk about memory, because that's really important. So we've talked about sort of the event of the trauma. Now let's talk about what's happening when we're putting information into our brain and how it's processing, because it's very different. So let's see. If we have a little bit of stress, like some good stress, you know, you have a deadline, or you have finals, or you're up against, you know, something that has a lot of intensity, some kind of a contest, or anything that exhibits like a little bit of good stress, that's okay. Some people actually thrive in that. I feel like I do, because I cut things really close all the time. Like I'm always kind of late, like I'm right up against the edge of things. I wait till the last minute to do things, but I feel like it feeds my creativity or whatever. So some people like thrive on that last minute stuff. Some people, that makes them very nervous. My deputy chief cannot stand it. She hates when I do that. I'm the last person on the plane every time. I always do it to her. So some people can tolerate that good stress, and it actually feeds them. It's the overwhelming stress layered with the threat of life or harm that is really bad for us. And that stuff is actually interrupts memory. So the good stress, you can actually push yourself to levels, to energy levels that are good, but the bad stress actually does the opposite, and it affects our memory. So first, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is what processes the information into our memories. The hippocampus in the brain, remember where I showed you where it was, that's going to take in the information. This is all information. Lots of different things. We hear things right now, we see things, we're feeling things, it's hot, it's cold, I'm thirsty, some of this information makes sense, some of it doesn't, I'm thinking about lunch. Any of that stuff that's coming in are all these little dots up here. Now, an encoding process is going to start happening, and it's going to start organizing that information. Right? It's going to organize it into sequence. It's going to categorize it. These are the things I feel. These are the things I'm thinking. These are the things I'm wondering about. It's going to start coding all of that together. And then it's going to consolidate it, because we don't remember every single thing that happened to us all day long, right? We don't remember every single detail. So we start to categorize like the important pieces of things, right? The important things that we really need to put into our long-term memory that we're going to recall later. We don't, I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday necessarily. I have to think about it for a while, but there's some information that I'm going to remember, like my login. I'm going to remember that every day, right? So it's going to put those things in a category so it knows what's important, what can we put in long-term memory, what do we need to keep in short-term memory, what do we need to keep using. So all the memories are starting to move into places so that it's going to go in neatly into our short and long-term memory. We're going to have categories. These are the things that are important. These are the things that we can put on the back burner. These are the things that we just heard that we're never going to use again. Let them go out of our head, not take any space. Our amygdala is going to process the emotional memory that come in. I used to do this a lot when I was a kid. Maybe I'm weird, but you know how you try to remember something? You're like, I really want to remember this moment. So you try to take everything in. So really the ones that you remember are emotional memories. Those are the ones that get really stuck in there. Those are the ones that you can recall. So if they're good memories, that's great. You remember a birthday party or winning something or a big game or something like that. But the challenge is that emotion can also be sad. So you also remember the intense things, right? The fight or the, in this case, it could be trauma or abuse or the sad thing that happened. Those things stay ingrained in your memory too. And that's the amygdala, because the amygdala is really good at processing that emotional memory and sticking it in there really, really deep. Now, the challenge later when we're doing trauma work and therapy will be to try to get that amygdala, that memory to fade enough to not cause that reaction over again, that HPA axis over again. So here goes the information. It's in categories. It's neatly organized. The brain knows where to send it now. But the problem is this whole process is very sensitive to those chemicals that I said are going to get released in the HPA axis. So with no trauma, without those chemicals being released, this is a nice, easy process here, right? With those chemicals, those little dots on the bottom go all over the place, and they don't get organized in the right way. So some things don't go into short-term memory, some things don't go into long-term memory. They're not in sequence. It's kind of all a mush of memory. So later when we try to recall it, it never went in the right way, so we can't bring it back out the right way. This way, non-trauma brain, we can pull those things out very easily. When it goes in incorrectly, then we can't pull it out very easily. It actually is very hard. So what happens during a sexual assault? The first thing is that those hormones are going to increase, right? Your body's going to respond to the trauma. All of those chemicals are going to start releasing. They begin with the acknowledging the danger, then your body's preparing to respond to the danger, and then the chemicals release so that you can do something about it. All of that stuff is flooding. It impairs functioning to the hippocampus. So remember, hippocampus is very important in memory, the storing and the categorizing in memory. So as soon as these chemicals come in, it starts affecting that part of our brain. And then we have memories fragmented. So in that last picture where you saw everything sort of in order, Because of this process that's happening, those little balls get all mixed up and spread all over the place. And then when they start storing, they're going to store in that same sort of order. So what we get is memory activated can be unpredictable and traumatic. So as they start to recall the memory, they're actually going to feel some of the things that were associated with what happened when they had the experience. So they get emotional and they get upset and they don't know why they're feeling upset and they can be angry. You know, victims that look sad pull us to go towards them. Victims that look angry push us away from them. But the anger and the fear come from the same place, come from the same trauma. It's just two different reactions to it. So during the trauma, they were experiencing a mix of emotions: anger, fear, frustration, terror, grief. All of those things are happening. So when they're recalling the trauma, all of those emotions are coming up again. So anger is in there, right? If you were the victim of this abuse, anger would be in there for you also. So just because they're sitting in someone's office getting services doesn't mean that anger doesn't come up. And that's a confusing one for people who are providing services. And then the events of the assault can be recalled accurately. It just takes time because the information went in incorrectly. So particularly during the first 30 minutes to 96 hours, Rebecca Campbell, this is Rebecca Campbell's slide. She's out of the University of Michigan. She says anywhere between the first 30 minutes and 96 hours, those chemicals are surging in our body still. And during that time, we cannot recall the information accurately. We're going to get chunks and pieces and fragmented and not in sequential order. But after the 96 hours, we can actually start putting those things together. Because remember, I said like a dream, that front part of the brain wants to make sense of the information, right? So that front part of the brain is going to kick in after those chemicals are gone and start to help sequence those things. Even though they were confusing in the beginning, that front part is going to try to make sense of them. Just like in the dream about your friend, it's going to try to make a story out of it and make it make sense, to make the memory make sense. So that will happen. It just takes time. So what do we do with victims of rape or exploitation or domestic violence? We rush in and we want all the information immediately, right as the crime has happened, right? It's actually the worst time to get information. So what we've been taught in law enforcement is that you need to get that information before people forget. For trauma victims, they actually, it's not forgetting that's the problem, it's recalling the information because it's been input in the wrong way. So they won't forget information. They just need time for all those chemicals to calm down so that they can recant them in a good order. So victims that get to go to sleep or have a meal or sit down or calm those chemicals down actually can better tell the story of what happened, but that's not how our system works. And so we're sort of self-defeating in that way. Alcohol is another layer of challenge to this. So alcohol is going to affect a part of the brain that can prevent encoding. So if it's just trauma, then the encoding can happen later when this front part of the brain kicks in, but alcohol can actually prevent that. Don't raise your hand if you've ever drank and not remembered something, but that's because that actually gets shut off by alcohol and other substances. And that's why people, and none of you or me, might not remember everything that happened the night before when they drank a lot, because that's going to get cut off, right? So they're not, it's actually going to prevent that encoding. So it's like those things didn't happen. It happens when you have anesthesia. Any kind of those chemicals that shut that off, you're not going to remember those things later on. And so alcohol is the one thing that is highly correlated with sexual assault cases, but actually then doesn't do what I said before, which is where the front brain will kick in and try to help make sense of things. So it can prevent encoding, which means there's nothing to retrieve. So the information never got put in there. The brain doesn't have anything to go back and try to make sense of, and so the information just doesn't exist. Unfortunately, these make very bad witnesses, and it leaves us without a lot of information about the perpetrator and about the sequence of events that happened, and then we can't do a lot about on the prosecution end of the case. Although we know that the person has been victimized, that's where we run into challenges in the legal system. All right, so what does it do to our recall? So trauma affects our recall. It affects how the information went in, and it affects how the information comes out. So we have fragmented, scrambled, or sketchy memory. So the memory went in disorganized, so the memory is going to come out disorganized. So sometimes victims start to remember pieces of things. This can happen when people are not really intoxicated but are intoxicated. They remember pieces of things and then it all starts to make sense. It's kind of a similar process. They're going to remember pieces of this. It's going to be fragmented. Someone else is going to tell them something like, you don't remember taking that picture last night. You don't remember texting that person. You don't remember we stopped to get food. And they're going to say, oh yeah, now I remember that. Those memories are going to start to come together, right? So they're sketchy, fragmented, and scrambled. The second thing is that they're not sequential. So that when they start to remember them, they're not in order. Like right now, if I asked you, what did you do first, second, and third this morning, you would remember. That's because your brain is over here, not in trauma. You can remember those things. But when somebody's in trauma, they're going to get bits and pieces, and they're not going to remember what happened first. The longer we wait after the trauma, some of that stuff might start to come together, but it's not going to be in order. So when someone is questioning them or taking their statement, their story seems scattered, right? They're going to say, I remember at the hospital I said this, oh yeah, and then we were talking at the bar, and the story's going to go all over. And so that law enforcement and other investigators have been trained that those are cues about lying or not telling the truth about the story, but it's actually just the way the traumatic brain is recalling. Then we have not fully contextualized. So sometimes they don't remember exactly what happened in all the details, right? I don't know, I was in a bathroom. I'm not really even sure where that bathroom was. I saw someone, maybe they look like they worked there. They don't have the context for a memory. So we can put ourselves back in context and remember things. Anybody have the experience of you walk into a room and then you forget why you walked into the room? So that's a pretty common, like minor memory issue. If you actually go back to the other room, you can sometimes remember it because you're back in that context. You're like, oh yeah, I was going to get a sandwich. And then you walk back into the kitchen. So context is lost in trauma because the memory wasn't full. We don't have that context to go back to give our brain some signals and say, okay, you were in the kitchen. What would you have been doing in the kitchen? You wanted a sandwich, right? So because all of those things didn't get coded, they don't have context to help them recall. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I had this group. I always feel like that.
Yes, yes. And the older I get, the more I feel like that. So you walk in and you're like, what did I come in here for? What was I about to do? Yes. Yep. Sorry, that just happens. That happens. So it happens for people with trauma too. And then it can be misinterpreted. So as they're recalling the information, because it's scrambled, because it's disorganized, because it's not sequential, sometimes they misinterpret the information. Like, I think I text someone, so that must mean that I wanted that person to come over. That must mean that I know them. They're trying to make sense of it, but they're not sure, so they're filling in the blanks about things. And that's how it gets misinterpreted. And then they can be accurate, but it takes time to overcome. So like I said, Rebecca Campbell says anywhere between 30 minutes and 96 hours, those chemicals go out of the body, and then the memories that have been stored, that have been coded, can be recalled, but it takes time. All right, and then we have somatic memory. So this is really interesting. Remember that I said that verbal part, that Broca's area of the brain is going to shut off. So that Broca's area is the verbal center of our brain. It's how we take information, think about it, and then are able to recall it. It's why if you want to learn something and remember it, a really good way to do it is to learn it and teach it to someone else, because then you're taking the information in, you're processing it, you're figuring out how to retrieve it and give it back to someone else, and that helps you really integrate information really well. So Broca's area really helps us with memory storage. People use flashcards, say things out loud, repeat things over and over again, make a song out of it. All those things that activate the verbal center of our mind help us to solidify that memory and organize it in a way that'll be easy to recall it, right? Your ABCs. You didn't learn a bunch of letters in a row. You learned a song so that you could remember the sequence. If I started with M and asked you to keep going, you'd have to go M and NOP. You'd have to do the song again probably in order to get that back, right? So it's how we encode things. So intense memories are encoded as sensory fragmentation. So here's what happens. We remember sensory pieces of an emotion. So one of the reasons why, one of the strongest is sense of smell. And that's because in this middle part of the brain, where the amygdala is here, we also have the olfactory, which is where we have sensations of smell. It's very close to that area. And for some reason, that gets activated at the same time because the chemical process is happening there. So we remember smells, we remember sounds, we remember feelings. And those recollections of those things don't make sense when people are asking us about the details of what happened in the trauma, so we don't tell people about those. Because if a police officer is asking me, tell me what happened last night, start with when you met this person, and I say, I remember smelling cinnamon, that doesn't make sense, right? And the person who is telling the story might think, why do I feel like I remember cinnamon? Why do I remember that smell? So they don't know how to make sense of it yet either. And so it's there, but they don't know what it is. So it's activated during the trauma. Sensations can trigger traumatic memories. So later, things that are associated with the trauma, like a smell. A lot of people that I've worked with that have sexual abuse that's related to alcohol, or having been at a bar when it started, or been in a bar or a restaurant, will recall that smell. I worked in a bar. I was a bartender here in Sacramento when I was in school. And there's that smell in the morning of the bar where it's like the yeast on the floor from some people know that smell. That can be very triggering to people who have had a crime that's related to alcohol or being in a bar or something. Those kinds of smells. I've had victims who were raped in bathrooms, and the smell of cleansers then will trigger the trauma. The bright lights, anything that's related to the trauma that they didn't integrate as verbal memory, but they integrated as sensory memory, can re-trigger the trauma, right? And then we don't know what those sensations that they integrated during that experience are. So we're out here with this brain that's all working close together, and we're like, why is that person so angry? Why is that person so upset? How come that person can't function and go to work anymore? How come that person can't be with their kids anymore? How come they have these weird behaviors that we don't understand? It's because things that we don't know that happened during the trauma are being triggered, and they don't know what they are either. So they're not always very clear. Like I had a victim, a young sexual assault victim, whose perpetrator had a mustache. And anyone who had a mustache gave her this sensation of fear. Teachers, people on the street, people on TV, anyone gave her that queasy feeling and made her feel bad right away. No one else would know that that was happening for her. No one else knew that that was what the perpetrator was bringing up for her. She didn't know that that was happening until we started kind of tracking what things were harder for her, and she started realizing that it had to do with people like that. Somatization of trauma. You can have aches, pains, and symptoms. So interesting. Sometimes we don't have the verbal part. Remember, we said in that trauma, we didn't encode it verbally, but our body encodes the feelings. So we can start to have aches and pains, things like backaches and headaches and stomach aches and body aches. They're all coming from the trauma. It's the body remembering what happened. There's actually a book called The Body Remembers. Without the conscious mind or the memory or the ability to recall what happened, our body is remembering what happened. So we can actually have, women can have chronic gynecological problems, chronic back problems, chronic pain. We have things like fibromyalgia or other inflammatory diseases that are related to trauma because the body is remembering and storing the trauma. Right, and then re-experiencing. So we have internal factors that can cause us to re-experience the event, and we have external factors. So the internal factors, oh, that was fancy, huh? Thoughts. So a thought can come into your head. This is really hard, particularly when I work with adolescents. Everything's going fine, and then they just think about the event again. Didn't have anything to do with what was going on. They got on the bus, they were having a good day. All of a sudden, some kind of thought about what happened to them comes back, and all of a sudden their mood shifts, the way they feel shifts, they start feeling sick. And the unfortunate thing that works really well in that moment is a substance or alcohol, because it'll temporarily stop all this stuff that's going on in here and take that away. And so that's how the substance abuse around trauma starts to develop, is that we use a substance to stop the pain in here, and it works, and then we are dependent on using that substance to make sure this doesn't get ignited again. So that happens for kids a lot. It's why I find a lot of adolescents and young adults use marijuana. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why adolescents and young adults use marijuana, but trauma victims use marijuana because it helps them sleep, and it stops the recurring thought. And then physical sensation. So, sometimes you get that hair on the back of your neck standing up feeling, you know, that feeling that you just get because you're scared or you're worried or something happens, the hairs on your arm stand up. That's a physical sensation that happens from some memory. Could be a good memory, but in the case of trauma, it could be a bad memory. So something is causing your body to react and get heightened. And then we have external factors, so things that happen around them that we can't control, often can't control, like a place. You know, they see a place that reminds them of it, or it could be the place of the crime. It could be something that's related to the crime. So very often, if someone has been traumatized at a place, they can't go back to that place, right? They stay away from it. So if it happens in your home, that's why we have to relocate people. If it happens in your neighborhood, then that's why we have to relocate people. If it happens at your school, then we have to move them to another school. It's going back to that place causes those sensations to come back. Items of clothing. So sometimes it's things that people wore, particularly around sexual assaults. It's things that people wore. And we see people unconsciously start to change the way that they dress, start to change the look of their body, all in this unconscious process of trying to not activate that trauma trigger. Accents. So people's accents, voice tone, male or female, those kinds of things can activate trauma. Colors, really interesting. In the moments of trauma, remember that the brain is remembering all of those sensory responses. So sometimes lights, colors, those come back up and cause people to go back into a trauma trigger. Smells, very, very strong, particularly for kids. They tend to remember smells. Maybe you remember a good smell when you were a kid, cookies baking, or what else? I used to like grape, like the grape cough syrup, you know, like that smell, or the grape popsicle. But those things remind you of something good, and those smells come back. They also come back in the trauma. And then time of day, very interesting, particularly with sleep. So what I find with trauma victims that I work with clinically, they'll tell me I don't sleep well. And then I'll say, what time do you typically stop sleeping well? Around 4 o'clock in the morning. Interesting. Around 4 o'clock in the morning is when the sexual assault happened. So their body is remembering the time of day and waking up, and they're not able to sleep because that hyperarousal is happening around that time because something bad happened during that time. A lot of kids have trouble sleeping because trauma usually happens at night. So domestic violence happens at night. A lot of substance abuse happens at night. Arrests happen at night. So kids have trouble sleeping because trauma happens at night and their body gets activated to prepare that something bad might happen again. Right, before I go on to misreading the effects, I don't know, time check. Oh, right there. Wow, I'm going fast. I'm talking really fast. You guys have to ask questions because I'm talking really, really fast. Any questions about what's going on with memory and coding? Yes. Yeah. Yes. So the question is, if a young child experiences a trauma, something that they witness, like domestic violence, and then they're removed from the situation, later, could they also use substances because they're recalling those memories? And the answer is yes. So particularly children, we have this kind of perception that kids are very adaptive, and they, you know, kids don't express their feelings in the same way. So we tend to overestimate how well they're doing. And we tend to underestimate their capacity to understand and to remember things. So remember that even if they're not remembering details in a narrative, they might be remembering sensations or feelings. And later, those feelings feel bad, and they're going to figure out how to get rid of those feelings. And there are healthy ways to get rid of them. And some of us develop healthy coping mechanisms for that. But many of us develop maladaptive coping mechanisms to deal with that. So the trauma doesn't go away. And what we would want to do if we treat it was we would take that child, we remove them into a safe place, and then we would work on helping them deal with what they do when those feelings start coming up, so that they don't have to stumble onto unhealthy things at work. They have tools in their toolkit to help them manage them when they feel bad now, right? That would be the healthiest way that we can do it. That's not the scenario that usually happens for people, though. So their substance abuse might happen later, and they don't even know that it's tied to this. And really, when we start getting into therapy and figure out that there's a lot of trauma that has happened there, that's kind of the work, right? We're not saying, oh, well, you use substances because of this. We're saying, what are the kinds of things that make you feel bad, that cause you to use substances, and where did those things come from? So that can absolutely happen, unfortunately. Cutting is the other one. And unfortunately, once somebody uses self-harm as a behavior and it works, then every time they're in a stressful or emotional situation, they're at risk for using cutting again. Even if they haven't done it in years, even if they've gotten older, they're at risk for it because it worked before. So they know what to do when they're in a lot of pain here, right? Any other questions so far about memory? Memory is really complicated, but it's an interesting process that happens for us. And it makes sense when you realize that if information doesn't go in correctly, then it doesn't come out correctly. Have you ever been studying late at night and you're reading and you're kind of like nodding off and then you can't remember what you read on the page? Right? So you're not taking that information in, right? It's useless. You should probably just close the book because you've gotten to the end of the page and you can't remember anything that you've read. You're not taking that information in, right? It's a similar process that's happening. You're not encoding the information. So there's no way you can recall it because you don't even remember doing that. I do that with driving sometimes. You do that with driving, like you're driving, then you're like, whoa, how are we in Sacramento already? Because you're not paying attention to every single thing around you. I went through the Altamont one time and then didn't realize I was through the Altamont. I was like, when is the Altamont coming? I had already gone through it because you're doing other things. You're talking, you're paying attention to something else. And so those memories don't go in there, so then you can't recall them. So I don't vividly remember going through that part, right? All right, let's talk about affect, emotions, and reactions. So this is the part that really starts to be a problem for victims. You know, understanding this process is important so that we understand that we with non-trauma brain are over here. So the way that we can think about what happened to somebody else is from this perspective here. What happened to them happened like this. The brain is having all different kinds of processes. And so they're not gonna take in the information, they're not gonna be able to recall it in the same way. If you take nothing else from this workshop today, but that will be really helpful. That people who experience trauma are in a different place. Then the second thing is that it's not just the moment, the day, the hour, the time that the trauma happened. It's every time that trauma gets activated, that process kicks in biologically for them. And then in those next moments, they also have trouble taking in information, understanding directions, recalling information later. So the trauma happens, we ask them questions, they don't know a lot of information. Pretty soon they're at victim services and we're helping them fill out an application, and then we tell them that they have to get X form and bring it to us or get us this information or get us this date, and then the next day they still haven't gotten it, and now we're like, what is wrong with you? We told you that you needed to do A, B, and C because we're over here and we can remember A, B, and C, right? But they can't remember A, B, and C. So sometimes we have to tell them A, B, and C over and over and over again because their brain is still like this and they can't take the information in. If you've ever been in a situation where you've had a health crisis or emergency and you're sitting and talking with a doctor and the doctor's telling you a lot of complicated information, as soon as you hear that something is bad, either it's yourself or someone else, your emotions have kicked in. You're sad, you're worried, you're terrified, all of those emotions are kicked in, and you don't remember which test they're talking about or what level they said or what needs to be done next. All of that information is not getting encoded for you. And so somebody else will be there and you'll say, what did they say about this? And what room did they say we have to go to? Because you don't remember that information. That's what's happening for our victims. Even though the trauma is over, they're emotionally triggered, thinking about, talking about, recalling, reporting to you, discussing, learning the next details, and they can't take that information in. So this is another point where I really try to work with advocates and claim specialists to say, I know to you, this seems frustrating because you can't understand why you've given this lady the phone number 5 times, but you've given her the phone number 5 times and she's like this. She cannot take that phone number in. She can't write it down. She can't remember where she put the phone number. It's why we do homicide calls. I call over the weekend and say, someone's going to call you on Monday. And they're going to say they're from victim services because you're not going to answer the phone on Monday and you're not going to remember who so-and-so is. And I'm just trying to give you some cues so that maybe on Monday you'll remember that somebody might be calling you and you'll answer the phone and then we can help you. Because right now you're in trauma brain. and you're not going to be able to take that information in. We don't give details and directions during that time because people can't absorb the directions and the details. And then the worst thing is if our systems blame them later, right? Because they don't have that information. All right, so let's talk about the affect and emotions. Anger, fear, disgust, and protection and depression are all ways to keep people away. So after the trauma, you know, we all walk into trauma with who we are. Our disposition, our experiences, our own reactions, all the things that we bring to the table. Trauma doesn't make those things better. Trauma exacerbates those things. So people who were difficult before trauma are difficult after trauma. People who were okay before trauma can be worse after trauma. Interestingly, the best predictor of how you're going to do post the trauma, post the healing, is how you were doing before. So if you have a relatively healthy adult who has a significant trauma, their likelihood of recovering is pretty high. Their likelihood of after treatment, after trial, after time, going back to pre-trauma functioning is pretty high. But for people who were not functioning well before trauma, or who have complex or chronic trauma across their lifespan, and then have another significant trauma, they actually do worse post-trauma because they don't go post-trauma. Their trauma continues. They don't go back to a safe place. They don't heal. They don't recover. They don't have people wrapped around them to take care of them. They continue to struggle, and their life continues to be chaotic and full of struggle. So those are the victims that are harder to work with. These are the victims that are more vulnerable because the trauma just exacerbates all their problems. It exacerbates their substance abuse. It exacerbates their mental health issues. It exacerbates their relationship challenges. And then they bring it all into the office and give it to you. So this is the stuff that my staff deal with, where they're like, oh my God, I've been trying to help this person and they're making me not want to help them. So that's what's going on here. It's also a way unconsciously that victims push people away, right? Something horrible has happened to me. Something that should not have happened to me happened. Someone hurt me. I didn't ask for it. I didn't need it. I'm wronged in this situation, and now I'm angry at everyone. And when you over here do anything that even touches that trauma, like not take care of me, not give me what I need, not give me information, put a roadblock in front of me, don't remove a roadblock, aren't kind to me, that triggers all of this anger that's really about this over here, right? So I walk into the office and someone doesn't say hello to me, and now I feel like everyone sucks. Everyone in the world is terrible. This is why terrible things happen. I shouldn't have even come here. No one's going to help me. All this stuff is already going on in my head before I've even talked to anyone because of this trauma that happened. Not because of you or the service that you're providing, but this stuff is getting activated already. So then when we say, you know, the police report says maybe you were contributing, oh my God, then that blows up in their face because of course, this horrible thing happened and now you're not going to help me and the world is terrible, and it just sort of makes everything worse for them, right? So the more we can do in those moments to have empathy, to have understanding, to try to be kind and gentle to people, the less we activate that trauma for them, right? Little things. We're building a new victims lounge on another floor because our victims lounge is very typical of law enforcement lounges. We've got glass with the little hole that they have to talk to us through, which is already like, you're bad, we're okay, we need to stay on the other side of you. We have that terrible furniture that people donated that nobody else wanted, and then it doesn't match and it's all over the place, and sit there for the next 10 hours while you wait for trial. I know it's uncomfortable, but just sit there. Water, no, we don't have water, but there's a gas station 2 blocks away if you want to walk down and get water. So we're already setting up this person who's had all these terrible things happen to them to say, yeah, life really isn't that great, and you're not going to have a great experience here either. So we're trying to make that better for them, right? A nicer place where you would want to sit down. Some water, a really necessary thing for human beings. Just some water, some tea, some light in the room. Sit down and read a magazine. Some things that make you doesn't activate the irritation that's coming really from the event, but we feed it with things like that, right? Walk up to a desk and talk to a human being and not have to look through the little hole. That's what we're trying to go through with the remodel, is to more humanize the experience, because remember, it's not the perpetrators coming in, it's the victims. But our systems have set it up that we are also distancing ourselves from the victim. So we have to fix that. Sorry, that was my soapbox for a second because I'm trying to get that room going. All right. Alexithymia. It's the inability to verbally integrate, identify the meaning of a physical sensation. So integrate the information and identify it. So this happens to victims a lot. They feel something, but they don't know what it means, right? I don't know why I feel upset. I don't know why things make me feel nervous. I don't know why things make me feel angry. And so if I don't know what it means and I can't verbalize it, then I don't tell other people because I don't think other people would understand what that is. So it just makes me feel bad, so then I just act out. I don't know why when I walk into a district attorney's office I feel angry. Well, I do. It's because this crime happened and the district attorney has a lot of power as they're trying to figure out if they can charge the case. And as you walk in, you're starting to feel all of that. And then that's making you be that irrational or unreasonable person that then security is called to get you out of there, right? That this whole process is happening because these sensations are happening and they can't identify what they are. But they're all related to the trauma. They're related to feeling like bad things have happened. When I got hired at the DA's office, the chief of staff said, no one comes here because it's a good day in their life. Everyone comes here because it's one of the worst things that have happened to them, right? So they're coming in with that. It's like people that go to hospitals or emergency rooms. Nobody's there for joyous things. Occasionally a baby maybe, but nobody's in an emergency room for something good. So you're already activated in ways. So the way that you're treated in those situations can either make those things better or they can make them worse. There's the hormone surge. So we talked a lot about those chemicals and those hormones that are happening, and those flood your systems and they don't let the other parts of your brain work correctly. Lying. So because of the insequential order, the fragmented information, the non-contextual storytelling, people think that they're lying. So if you ask law enforcement or police officers how often they think a sexual assault victim lies, they'll tell you about 50% of the time. In studies, the actual figure is between 2 and 5%. So it's very low incidences of, and not lying about the complete event, but lying about any details. So we have very, very low probability that people are not telling the truth. Yet the perception is that people are lying because of the things that happen with memory, recall, and about telling the story. Normalizing reactions. So people that experience trauma are having all these sensations and feelings and thoughts that they don't understand. And so then they start to feel like something is really wrong. And you would think with this brain over here, well, I would tie that back to this. I would say that that's because of this. But sometimes the behaviors don't seem related. Like, all of a sudden my back hurts all the time and that makes me feel bad and I can't get out of bed and I can't work. And I don't know where that came from. But now on top of this event that happened, I have this health problem. They're probably related, but they're not putting those two things together. And so things are exacerbating for them. So victims sometimes get way worse before they get better. And sometimes their problems compound. And when we're working with them, we think, oh, this person's just trying to get more out of us. Or this person, now they've got this problem too, or now this, and how is that related to that? We have had a victim that wants more and more stuff, right? Like every time we give them something, then they ask for something else. And it's very activating for everyone, including myself, to think that every time we give them something, they want more. But that's coming from the fact that they were walking down the street, minding their own business, and something horrifying happened to them. So now they feel like nothing is fair and that they deserve more, right? Because something horrible has happened to them. So that's the stuff that's playing out over here. Numbing. So numbing is sort of this process that happens where your feelings get detached from the event that has happened. This is a big problem for victims because law enforcement is trained to read emotions and reactions, correct? So remember I said that the person that looks sad and needs our help, we are going to naturally move into that person because they look like what we think of as troubled, grieving, sad, in need of support. But the person that's angry and even belligerent or resistant or numb is also a person that's traumatized. That's just the way that they're reacting to it. So we misread that information and think that they're lying. So this is a very common response from lots of people, including victim advocates and law enforcement and attorneys, they just didn't look like they were sad about this. They didn't have the right reaction to that. They didn't look like they were that upset, or if they were so upset, then why did they text someone right after that? Why did they have a drink right after that? Why did they go to a party? Why did they go out with a friend? Why did those things happen? Because the brain is here and our brain is over here. So their brain is making decisions based on not being fully functioning, right? Not working in the way that it'll work later when we're talking to them or where we're coming from. And so they're doing things that are trying to make sense of what's happening. There's lots of chemical processes that are happening that are causing them to do incongruent behaviors, right? And then later when we look back on them, we're making judgments in lots of ways. We're making judgments given what we're going to provide them in services, what we're going to give them in compensation, what we're going to do for them in the case, whether or not we think they're going to be a good witness. We're making a bunch of judgments, but we're not remembering that this stuff is coming from somewhere else. So numbing is one of those behaviors, that they look flat. Remember that I told you that that opioid is going to cause a flat affect. So, you know, they're telling me this horrible thing, but they're not crying. That makes me suspicious. Well, that's because a biochemical process is happening and their body is shutting down because they can't, if they would be flooded if they actually reacted to it. Now, a couple of days later, they might be at the grocery store and they're going to fall apart. And it didn't happen then, but it's going to happen later. Maybe you've had this. You've been able to deal with someone else's trauma or deal with someone else's situation, and you get in the car by yourself and then it hits you, right? Or you lay down to go to bed and everything quiets down and then it hits you. So it just because someone is not reacting the way that we think they're supposed to react doesn't mean that it didn't happen or that they're not going to have that reaction later. Dissociation. So this is interesting. This is actually a qualifier for PTSD now. It's an involuntary attempt to protect yourself. It's kind of what we talked about with the freeze or the tonic immobility. It is a way that people learn to disconnect themselves from what's happening in order to survive it. So what I've heard kids say a lot is that there's something called derealization. That when something traumatic is happening to them, they convince themselves and put themselves in another place to say, this is not happening. It's just not happening. It's not real. It's not happening. And that's how they survive it. Or depersonalization, that they can actually make themselves go somewhere else and think, this is not happening to me. I'm outside of myself while this is happening to my body. I can disconnect the two things. I've had kids tell me that they can actually recall being abused, maybe laying in a bed, and they see themselves above it watching themselves. So they've actually dissociated in a way that they've disconnected themselves from what's happening because they just couldn't tolerate. They were flooded with the trauma of it and couldn't tolerate it, so they had to remove themselves from it consciously or unconsciously so that they couldn't see what was going on. How about questions? Because I talked really, really fast and went quickly. Any questions about how this plays out in your job? Yes? So it's a little bit different. So schizophrenia involves delusions. It involves an alternate reality. So we have normal kind of psychosis. Normal neurosis that people have, just sort of worry, problems. Then we have borderline, which is in the middle. Borderline is between psychosis and neurosis. And psychosis is actually when there are delusions associated. It's a different trauma can be driving schizophrenia. It's also a biochemical process, but it's different because people are in some different form of reality, whether it's visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, thought disorder, some of those things happen there. It's different than dissociation. Dissociation is kind of a coping mechanism or a temporary fix to disconnect from what's going on, and then they go back to normal function. It's just how they tolerate a trauma. The case that I worked on, where the woman would go into that kind of catatonic state, she tended to dissociate moving forward on lots of different things. She just didn't deal with things because she didn't have a lot of coping mechanisms to deal with things. And so the way that she did was she would kind of check out when things got tough or stressful for her. So it's a temporary tool, coping mechanism. Any other questions about how it relates to your work? Yes. Yeah. That's not my area of research, so I don't know, but I know that the trauma associated with someone, you know, feeling like their life is in jeopardy or their life is ending, that can activate all of those trauma symptoms, not only for them, but for the people around them, their caregivers, their loved ones. But I don't know much about the chemical process with like chemotherapy or other cancer treatment drugs. Be interesting though, see what those do. Yes. Please, and I have to keep repeating because then I forget to repeat.
I was going to state that you had mentioned that, say, for example, with victims of sexual assault, when they've had alcohol, and I work in the appeals section, and when we get things that have been recommended for denial, and you're reading over the crime documentation, that, you know, I thought that was really good that you stated the encoding process, you know, but you also mentioned that there means that they might not be able to remember or retrieve any information. And I see that as well as the cases where we get people who, put it lightly, mentally delusional because of the way they write. You can tell there's something mentally going on and they're paranoid about the whole system.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they may not have been actually a victim, because I would think that they're more vulnerable to having something occur. It's just like what happened to them, you know? So
hard to tease out what happened because they're not going to be a good reporter of what happened to them, right?
Exactly.
That's why we have a lot of chronic victimization in both of those populations, right? People who use substances and people who have mental health issues. So the alcohol, it's interesting. It depends on the degree to which someone drank. It depends on, you know, some people can recall things, right? We can have a couple of cocktails and recall most things. We can have 4 cocktails and recall most things. The more you drink, the less capacity you have to recall those. The more substance you use and the kind of substance, the less ability you have to recall things. So they're not often good advocates for themselves. And then sometimes we have to have collateral information, right? The saddest stories, I think, are where, you know, there was a more sober person with them who saw what happened and didn't intervene, but then they're a witness to say, yeah, I saw that person take them into another room, or I saw that person put them in their car. They might have the information that the victim themselves doesn't have. And it doesn't mean, I mean, I think the important thing is that we're not misinterpreting that as them lying or them, you know, withholding information. It's that information has not been encoded. They just cannot retrieve it. It's not there. They don't know what happened during that time. Any other ways you think this might be related to your work? Yes? The 96 hours? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. I think that I've had experiences with both. I've had some reports that I've seen or some victims that we've worked with where the information was only taken at the beginning, and then the victim a few days later is telling us more information, but it's not in the report, so we're trying to collect some collateral information. And then I've seen some really well-trained people, and a big shout out to our SVU department in San Francisco, who are very good at going slow with questioning, coming back to people, giving people time. They call us in to do MDTs or MDIs, and we feed people and we sit with them for a while, and then they question them. And so all of that stuff helps calm down the chemicals so that they can give you a better story. But not everyone has the time or the capacity to do that, right? If you're the cop responding to an incident, you don't have the time that somebody in a specialized unit has to go to a special place and feed people and sit them down. And so, I mean, I get the real life restrictions around that. But what we've been trying to do in San Francisco is then if the victim comes back with more information or different information, then trying to figure out if we can get any of that collateral information to help with the claim, right? That we now have more information than we had before or at the time of the event, and can we use that to try to help the person get the support that they need? And I think that we need to consider that more, particularly in cases where we know trauma happened and the information came in right away. Also, the idea of contributing. So remember that fight, flight, or freeze response, those chemicals that are surging? It causes people to do things when they think that they're in survival that you might not do when you're over here and not in survival. So like get out of your car or hit someone or be aggressive or say something. All those things that could be considered contributing are not necessarily under someone's conscious control when they're in a really chaotic, traumatic event, right? We do things that over here we wouldn't do. I mean, I'm not saying any of you have ever done anything you wouldn't do when you were upset, but if you have ever gotten into an argument and driven off fast, and you probably don't do that every day when you leave work, but you get in an argument and you're activated and you do something different, or you scream, or some reaction that you don't do on an everyday basis, when this part of your brain is activated, you do that, right? Cuss, scream, drive away fast, throw something. All of those things are reactions. You don't do it sitting here, but you get activated and you would do it. So victims do it too. And we sort of have this idea that victims look one way, and if they're really a victim, then they wouldn't do this. But there's a process going on for them too. And their body is responding. And we don't know what has happened to them before. Say this victim was the victim of physical abuse their entire life. Somebody comes at them aggressively. They're protecting themselves. All of a sudden they're involved. Doesn't mean they weren't a victim, right? We don't know all of these things that have triggered them to have the kind of response they are going to have. Some people are going to fight. Some people are going to flight. Some people are going to freeze. All of those are trauma reactions. They're just going to happen because of their experiences. Is there another question? Yes.
Let me come to you with the.
I feel like Dr. Phil right now.
I'm just curious. I know I'm not processing claims or something. Something about elder abuse.
Huh?
I mean, how do you guys do or read the emotions and reactions, especially if it's dementia or, like a short-term memory?
Those are really hard, particularly because a lot of elder abuse violence and trauma is coming from caregivers. So there's a lot of complexity in reporting, integrating what has happened. There's a high cost to reporting those kinds of things. And then we have on top of that medication, health conditions, things like dementia, age, memory and aging memory. We have a lot of layers in there. So, some of it is getting to know someone, giving them time, listening to the story, trying to pull out pieces, and then help them recall or document things that are happening. But it's harder. There are different populations that this is harder with, right? We work with homeless people, and maybe they're using substances. It doesn't mean that they weren't a victim of a crime, but they're not a good reporter in their own event, right? Because they're using substances, because they have mental health issues, because they're malnourished, and haven't slept. Those kinds of things don't facilitate good memory, good recall, and good reporting. So we have to piece some of that stuff together for them, because they still have been a victim of a crime and still need resources. They're just not good at acting on their behalf. Now, here's the difference. If we have a child that does that, we have a lot of sympathy, right? Of course, this 2-year-old can't tell us what happened, so we're going to get a lot of collateral information. But if we have a 50-year-old homeless man who uses substances, we tend to lose empathy for that person. Well, they shouldn't have been out there, and if they weren't drinking, this wouldn't have happened, and that's why people shouldn't be on the street. We've got a lot of judgment, but there's some capacity issues for both of those groups, right? And if we thought about it that way, rather than our internal bias about how we feel about what people are doing to contribute to their own crime, we actually could help people get better. We could think about that both of those scenarios need help and that they need to get better, right? We wouldn't expect a 2-year-old to know every detail of the case and be able to recall it, but somebody who has chronic mental health issues and substance abuse issues, we shouldn't expect that they can report it chronologically and accurately, otherwise it didn't happen either, right? Yes? Sorry, if you don't mind the mic, that way they can hear on the video.
I work here in the mental health section, and we, right before we came down here, we got a treatment plan from a provider, and one of the it was sexual assault, but the claimant is a derivative victim, and one of the symptoms listed on there was DID. Is that something that you would typically see in a derivative?
That would be hard to make a judgment without knowing the case. I think of derivative victims as having secondary trauma to an issue. But what I could say, without knowing anything about the case and not making a judgment, is that people who have underlying mental health issues, if they are triggered by witnessing or experiencing trauma, their mental health issues get exacerbated. So that's the question I would ask is, was this an underlying issue? Are you saying that it was exacerbated? You know, is the person using substances or something in order to manage the symptoms that got triggered by this? Those would be the questions I would ask. But a significant mental health issue coming out of being experiencing secondary trauma, I'd have to know more about the case.
We believe that she had her own childhood trauma that's stemming from. So
yeah, so she's probably had some underlying issue for a long time, and then witnessing this somehow triggered her trauma stuff, and now she's having symptoms associated with it. So that's very likely, right? It triggers people's substance abuses, relationship problems, depression, anxiety. Trauma doesn't make any of that stuff better. It makes that stuff, can make that stuff worse. Eating disorders, anything that people have underlying can get much worse when they are the victim or a witness of a trauma. The problem we're having right now is listing people as victims on a police report. So two people might be standing on a street corner. One of them gets shot randomly. The other person just witnessed somebody dying, could have been the victim very easily, watched someone die, maybe even contributed to that, but they're never listed on the police report. Yet now they're having major depression and can't work and all of these things, and we can't get them resources because they were lucky enough to not be the person that the bullet hit, but they were there, right? That's still extremely traumatizing to be in front of them, right? That's another big challenge we have right now. Just throwing that out there for anybody looking at that claim. That's one that we're working with. We're trying to get the police to be better about listing them on the police report, so then we can do that. But this is information that people don't get. I do the training for the crisis intervention team in San Francisco, and trying to talk about what happens for people with trauma so that everyone kind of understands what these behaviors mean and what the potential reactions are that come from people who've experienced trauma. Yes?
You said that this is
yes. I'm not sure. You know, I have 2 masters and a doctorate, and I never took a class on trauma in any of those programs. So even clinicians don't get good training on trauma. It's interesting too, because students, clinical students, are sent out to all of our community organizations, all of our community health clinics, and they don't get a lot of good training on trauma. There's just not. There's you know, in the last 25, 30 years, there's been a big push on evidence-based practices. I think that takes up a lot of space in training programs, and I'm not against those things. I just think that also understanding behavior and reaction is really important, and so they don't get as much attention. Those programs are often pretty structured, like what people get in them. It's why I started doing these trainings about 10 years ago, and I do them for probation officers, judges, police officers, district attorneys. I actually did a training for my DA office before I went to work there around secondary trauma. So helping people who are not clinical understand what happens with trauma, I think is really important, because the likelihood that even the victims that we work with ever make it into a psychologist's office is very low, because the brain is still activated and traumatized. And, you know, the idea of containing it and going to an office and getting therapy, for some victims who are resourced in ways of internal resources that can do that, that works well. But for a lot of victims, that's not going to happen. And people have a hard time understanding that too. Well, you had this trauma, we're offering you therapy, how come you didn't go? There's a bunch of factors in there that are contributing to them not being able to go in and sit down. And one of the biggest ones is that they're going to re-experience some of that trauma, right? They're going to talk about it. They're going to feel things again. The very things that they're trying to push away maybe and not experience, you're asking them to go sit in an office and talk about. And even though that would make it better, it's really hard to do. So even high functioning people without trauma struggle to go to therapy and work on things. When people are in trauma, it's actually quite hard for them to do that. So the better strategy, I think, to touch the most people is to train people that are not clinicians, that will understand trauma and then can provide responses that are better for people who've experienced trauma, right? To lean into people rather than away. I do a training in my office called Working with Hard to Work with People. And we talk about how people who've experienced trauma are really good at pushing everyone away, because you are all potentially people who are going to let them down, frustrate them, or hurt them. So if they push you away first, they decrease the pain that you're going to cause them. Only they're the most vulnerable and in need of the service. So we have to figure out how to work around their behavior, not exacerbate or activate their behavior, and actually get them the kinds of resources that they need. And the upfront stuff, the way that we treat people upfront, is really, really helpful. The clearer things are, the less frustrated we are with repeating things, the more information that we can give in multiple ways so that people can take it in. Those are all important things when we're working with victims. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. We do, and then we check back. So one of the things that I've done recently on homicide victims is, you know, the advocate will get, I might make the first phone call and say, we're going to call you, I'm very sorry for your loss. We're going to call you on Monday, someone's going to get assigned. Here's kind of the range of things you might be eligible for. That way I'm sort of prepping them that if you get this call, it's not, it's an important one. Somebody might be able to help you, right? And then the advocate's going to work with them on the short-term needs. What do you need right now? How do we bury your loved one? Do you want mental health resources? This kind of stuff. And then our RGA, my boss, George Gascon, might make a call later to the victim and check in. And during that call, I might say something like, I noticed that we had a case where the mother was killed and we were calling the grandmother, and there were two of her grandchildren, the two sons of the victim. And I said, I noticed that your grandsons, who are both young adults, did not apply for victims' compensation. And I'm wondering if you could help us help them to apply for victim compensation. And she says, you know, I asked them and they're not interested in getting therapy right now. And I said, I understand that. I get that. This has all happened. It's probably shocking, traumatizing, overwhelming right now. But here's the thing. You know, your grandsons are young, and when they have the next birthday or the next anniversary or their graduation or they get married or they have a child, these things are going to surface then. And we could have these resources set up for them now if we could do this claim now, so that later when they need it, it's available to them. And then the grandmother said, that makes sense. I'm going to tell them that they need to do it. And then we get the two boys in and then they apply for it. So it takes a little bit more work than maybe we've been doing. And we do not do it on all 6,000 cases. I'm not going to claim that we are able to do that. But when we can catch it, I think it's a really good thing to do for people. And just explain, just that little explanation that right now you're in shock. Right now you don't want to talk to anybody else. But in a couple of years, when it starts setting in that you no longer have your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your spouse, that might be when you need it. And that's what compensation is excellent for, right? That it's there when you need it. So that a little psychoeducation is really helpful around that. Any other questions? I want to thank you all for sitting here through this training. I know that it's not necessarily directly what you're doing, but I think it's really important for the victims that we serve. I'm very passionate about getting this information out and helping people in their everyday job use this information and integrate it to help them in what they do. So thank you very much for being here today.
Let's give her a hand. Thank you so much, Dr. Castro-Rodriguez.
Thank you.